evening, everyone. I'm Melinda Jarrett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fredericton Region Museum. I'd like to welcome everyone to our 5th virtual presentation in the York Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series with author Peter Little, who will be speaking this evening on Abraham Beverly Walker, the first Canadian-born Black lawyer, and for those with an interest in journalism, he was also Canada's first Black magazine editor. This virtual speaker series was organized by Charles Ferris, member of the Society's Board of Directors and chair of the Society's Programs Committee. We're also very fortunate to have the assistance of IT professional extraordinaire Stephen Thomas, who has helped us to set up the event tonight on Zoom, and committee member Peter Malmberg, who helped us with the publicity and the promotion. I'm going to ask Dr. Mary Louise McCarthy, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight.
And welcome, everyone. It is my esteemed pleasure to introduce Mr. Peter Little. Peter retired after approximately 40 years of work as a production planner at the Irving refinery. He worked 20 years in the lab and 20 years in planning. He has lived in St. John all of his life, and he is a history nut, specifically local history. Peter's especially interested in stories that are outside the mainstream. And Peter has written 3 books. He has 2 more books that he hasn't been able to get published because he feels the audience is limited. However, the presentation today, Peter has written a beautiful book about Abraham Beverly Walker. That's the book. He'll tell you after he speaks how to get copies. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Peter Little.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Charles and Melinda, for inviting me here today. I'll get right into it. Over 130 years ago, the phrase Black Lives Matter may not have been part of our lexicon, but one lone New Brunswicker was campaigning for that very ideal. And that man was Abraham Beverly Walker. And this is Black Lives Matter circa 1880. Now, there's 3 things you need to know about Abraham Walker before we get into his life and work. The first is he was a devout Christian. The secondly was he was staunchly loyal to the British Crown. These 2 things you'll see playing out throughout his writings and throughout his lectures. The third one we'll get to in just a second. First, a little bit about his upbringing. He was of Loyalist stock. He was born in 1851. He was one of 8 sons and 3 daughters to William and Patience Walker. He was born in Cars, just on shore of Jenkins Cove. Their farm is indicated here on the map by the wide blue arrow. Now, he began his illustrious academic career at the one-room schoolhouse in Cars, which is about a mile from the home, and that's indicated by the narrow blue arrow. But after his primary schooling was finished, like probably grade 5, 6, something like that, he moved to the bigger school in Kingston, which was the shire town of the county at the time. And that's where he caught the eye of this man, the Reverend William Elias Scoville. Scoville was the priest at Trinity Anglican Church in Kingston, which is just across the street from the school. The interesting thing about Scoville was he had developed his own unique brand of shorthand note-taking. And before Abraham finished his secondary schooling, he had mastered this. Now, along about 1870 or so, I'm not sure exactly of the date, Abraham's father passed away, and he moved to St. John with his mother and a couple of sisters. Now, although they were Anglican by faith, they were also quite involved in St. Philip's African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city's south end, and especially the ladies. His sisters and later his wife were quite involved in committees for the poor at St. Philip's. Now, one of his first jobs when he moved to St. John, he put his shorthand note-taking to good use. And he went to work for this guy, Orson Squire Fowler, who was a noted American phrenologist. For anybody who doesn't know, a phrenologist is one of these quasi-scientific quacks who figured they could determine a person's intellectual level by the size, shape, and feel of their skull. And so Abraham went to work for him, at first just taking notes, shorthand as Fowler applied his craft on his clients. But very soon after, he began to study the craft of phrenology himself and became Fowler's understudy, became quite proficient at it. Now, working with Fowler gave him the chance to travel. And they traveled throughout Canada and parts of the US, but he also traveled to England. And it was here that he had his first epiphany on race issues. And when he came back from his time in the UK, he said that every Black Canadian should make at least one pilgrimage in their lifetime to either England or Ireland to see just exactly how race issues should be handled. I think that was the spark that lit the fire in his belly for what was to come. So he came back in 1874, finds him in St. John with his own business. He's advertised here in one of the St. John papers as a stenographer, a phonographer, or a shorthand note taker, a scribe, and law reporter. He contracted himself out for these chores. He also taught the Scoville brand of shorthand note taking. And if you look in the bottom bit of the ad, he did phrenological examinations as well to determine a person's aptitude. So he worked at that for a couple of years, and his shop was at the corner of Princess and Canterbury Street. And this intersection will play kind of a prominent role in his various careers going forward. So a couple of years later, he decides he's going to put down some roots, settle down, sort of, as much as Abraham Walker could settle down. And he married a lady from Nova Scotia named Eliza Ruth Marsh. And they began a family of 5 children. Now, sadly, only one of those children would live long enough to have children of his own. But Abraham had a thirst for knowledge, just an unquenchable thirst, it seemed. And so working for himself as a scribe didn't really cut it. So with the encouragement of and under the mentorship of local barrister George Gilbert, he enrolled in the law school at the National University in Washington, D.C. And that was in 1878. And 3 years later, he graduates, returns home, and is sworn in as an attorney to the Supreme Court of New Brunswick. And of course, the next year, he's admitted to the bar. And excuse me. And then he opens his own law practice. Well, there's a courthouse, practices in the courthouse. He opens his own law practice here in the Ritchie building, which is also at the corner of Princess and Canterbury Street. But he has a very difficult time making a living as a barrister. Racism in St. John especially, but in New Brunswick at the time, was systemic. It was very deeply ingrained, and he had a hard time getting any clients. Not only that, but he had to endure the slings and arrows of his colleagues. Everything from racial insults in open court from opposing attorneys to snubs from the Law Society itself for functions. And twice later on, he was promised the Queen's Counsel and later the King's Counsel designation. And both times his name was taken off the list simply because of the color of his skin and the lobbying of others. So he had a very difficult time. So in order to supplement his income a little bit, but also to stoke the fire that was set in his heart back in the UK. He began lecturing, and the earliest record I could find of a lecture that he gave was in 1884 at the Mechanics Institute. And it was called A Glimpse at the Present World or the Decline and Death of Civilization. Now, reading through his various lectures and stuff, Abraham Walker was not above opening the door of angst just a little bit, just to shock people. And as you can tell by the title of this, it probably did shock conservative old white St. John quite a bit. The gist of his talk was society's moral decline in racially intolerant times. It was very well attended. It was the people who were there thought a lot of what he said. The only negative comment was that it was a bit dry, but I think he tended to talk over their heads maybe a little bit. So he continues to lecture locally, and by the next year, he's given his drive for equal rights a name, and he calls it Christian Socialism. This ad was taken from the Daily Telegraph a day after a talk on Christian socialism. It sounds like a political movement, but really it isn't, because he said that I'm no politician and I hope never to become one. So it's a pretty smart guy right from the get-go, if you ask me. In his brand of socialism, he wasn't against capitalism per se, so long as a good deal more of the wealth got poured back into the wages of the workers. He also advocated that all property in the province be held in common for the use of the populace. And he advocated for free universal Christian education. And this is the third pillar in his ongoing philosophy, education. He continually pounds away at wanting equal educational opportunities for Black folk. As the schools in St. John at the time were still segregated for the most part, and the Black schools were an on-again, off-again thing. I found different stories in the newspaper where the Black school closed up because the teacher moved on, and now they can't find one, and it's, and then the school goes away itself. So it was an on-again, off-again thing. The other thing that he advocated for in his brand of Christian socialism, which kind of surprised me and may be welcomed by the ladies in the audience, was he advocated for universal suffrage. Now, this is 32 years before women got the right to vote in Canada. And Abraham Walker was up on the stump saying that not only should women be given the right to vote, they should be given an active say in the running of government, because it would only show a marked improvement, because men have really mucked it up so far. As one might expect in the white patriarchal society of the day, this didn't go over very big. So as time goes on, as we all know, there was no progress on his social agenda. So he began to gradually ramp up the rhetoric, and he began calling out the Canadian and the American governments for their mishandling of race issues. And most especially, he was hard on Canada, and where he said that there is not a single Black man in public office anywhere in the country, not even in the lowly justice of the peace job. Now, this is right after, he said this not too long after his first Queen's Council snub. So he was still pretty bitter about it, hence the dig about the JP. So he decided, the heck with you, I'm going to move away and set up shop elsewhere. And so he decided he was going to move to Atlanta, Georgia. He would go down, set up shop, get himself established, and then sort of send for his wife and young family. And so off he goes. Now, on the surface of it, Atlanta looked like a really good place for a young Black professional to establish himself. the demographics of the city were such that it was like a 48-52 split, black and white. There was an emerging black middle class. There was black schools, black university, black churches, black doctors, black professionals. So it looked like a really good place. So he's down there for just a little over a year, and all of a sudden he's back. The grass is not always greener on the other side of the fence, apparently. And this little thing called Jim Crow, I believe, although he didn't come right out and say it, at least in any of the writings I found, was a big part of it. Another part that he doesn't come right out and say it, but in his magazine Neath in 1903, he writes about witnessing the aftermath of a lynching of a black man in great gory detail. And I think that would be reason enough not to want to live in Atlanta. So anyway, he's back. His attitude towards the Americans takes a complete 180-degree turn. He was singing their praises before he left. When he came back, he had not much good to say about the country. And a few years later, he made 3 predictions concerning the United States. The first 2 have come true with uncanny accuracy. And they are, the first one was, and he was only off on the timing. He said that he could foresee the day in his lifetime when a black man held the most powerful position in the world. Now, some will equate this to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. His second prediction was the rise of populism in the US and an astonishingly accurate description of its leader. And the only thing missing from this description was a picture of Donald Trump himself. And the third prediction was he said that by 1950, he could foresee the total collapse of the American Republic, and that only another bloody civil war would set things right. A lot of this he blamed on the American Constitution itself, which he said was pristine and unwieldy and wholly inadequate to look after the exigencies of a great nation. So he's back in St. John. He reopens his law office, and it fails again. He's not able to make a living. So he takes a position as a librarian in the law library for the St. John Law Society. And either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which side you're on, this gives him more time to work on his drive for equal rights, which now has a new name, and he calls it Fair Play and Justice. And anyway, he eventually got so preoccupied with this that he lost the job as the law librarian. But before that happened, he, again, at the corner of Princess and Canterbury Street, in 1892, the St. John Law School opened. This was part of King's College in Windsor at the time. It later became the UNB Faculty of Law. And when it opened its doors, Abraham Walker was the first student of any color to enroll. So another reason why his name should be on Ludlow Hall, if you ask me. So there's 3 things at 3 different corners of that same intersection that played a role in his career. His first major treatise to the public on fair play and justice, after a few years of lecturing and traveling around locally, was in the St. John Globe in 1897, in the Saturday supplement to that paper. He had a 6-part series throughout the spring of that year called The Trials, Hardship, and Destiny of the Negro Race, an appeal to the tribunal of humanity for fair play and justice. And he begins this 6-part series with an analogy, and he uses one that is easy for the local white folks to understand, and it's that of a foot race between 2 people. One man is well-fed, well-trained, well-equipped, and he has a lot of cheering fans in the audience. Second man is poorly trained, poorly fed, barefoot, and not only does he have no fans, but he's jeered by his supporters' fans. And of course, at the end of the race, the well-fed man wins, but only by half a nose length. And this chap, obviously, is the Caucasian race, and the other man is the black race. Now, the whole point of this was that given equal educational opportunities by leveling the playing field on education, the black man will be able to establish or create their own great philosophers, great theologians, great intellects, and great businessmen. And if you look at the outcome of the race, where the poorly trained man loses by only half a nose length, it's kind of the first hint at what's coming down the pipe next from him, and that is the notion of black superiority. This, as I said before, the constant thread in his push for equality is equal education. He said by leveling making things equal for blacks and whites as far as education goes, was the key to economic and social emancipation for the black man. Now, one of his favorite quotes, his favorite quotes of mine, is education expands the mind and gives elasticity to thought. Anyway, Abraham Walker himself was a very highly educated man. By the end of his life, he had several degrees, very well read. He was a student of the classics. He was a brilliant orator. Reading his lectures, one is reminded quite a lot of Martin Luther King. And he was fluent in 5 languages. He claimed to have a passing knowledge in 4 others. And in the last months of his life, he was studying Japanese and Bantu simultaneously. So he had a busy mind, and like I said earlier, he had a constant thirst for knowledge. But he was also a man of the highest moral standards, and never, according to his obituaries, never spoke ill of anybody. But that doesn't mean he didn't call people out that stepped over the line. And he saved his sharpest criticism for these folks. He tore into the New Freeman, the local Catholic newspaper, for their treatment of, or for what they said about Émile Zola, the French novelist and journalist, when he passed away. Now, Walker and Zola were at polar opposite ends of the spectrum when it came to religion, but Zola was also a proponent of basic human rights. And for this reason, Abraham Walker tore into the New Freeman and gave them the sharp edge of his tongue. He also saved some very sharp criticism for some members of his own race. There was an incident in St. John where some local white youth, young men, probably in their early 20s or so, coerced some local black chaps into performing for them. And the newspaper doesn't lay it out, but if you read between the lines, it's probably some minstrel music. The stuff that came out of it was born in the Deep South, originally performed by whites in blackface, and then later picked up by the slaves. And anyway, he was especially hard on those young men that will allow themselves to be the butt of the white man's jokes. And it's very unlikely that he collected any CDs from these two. Another St. John pair, James and George Bogie, were making a small fortune in the minstrel on the minstrel circuit in England at this very time. So, still going down the road, there's no progress on social justice or racial equality, and he begins pushing the notion of black superiority to the forefront of his talks. And he said that although he admits that currently the Caucasian race is the superior race on the planet, he said the destiny belongs to the black man. He goes into great detail in a little pamphlet that he released in 1905 called A Message to the Public. He wrote this as president of the African Civilization Movement, which he founded here in St. John. But 1905 was not the first time he began pushing this idea. He'd been just around 1900, the whole idea of black superiority came to the fore. And he, part of his reasoning was that the black race was the first race on the planet, that the Homo sapiens sprang from Africa, which is a theory supported even today. And three of the greatest civilizations of antiquity were all black races: the Phoenicians, the Ethiopians, and the Egyptians. And all the other civilizations, the Caucasian, the Asian, the Indian, and everybody else sprang from it as people migrated north, east, and west, and then eventually to the Americas. Now, I can't imagine that this theory went over very well with the local Caucasians who weren't accustomed to taking second chair to anybody. But here he makes another prediction, and none of us will live long enough to see it, but he claimed that it was the absence of Christian love that spawned the practice of slavery, and it's going to be the absence of Christian love that proves to be the downfall of the white race, saying that within 500 years, the Caucasian race will fall from dominance, and the black race will be uniquely situated at that time to once again be leaders amongst all races. He did let his frustration get the better of him a couple of times. On one occasion, he mused about what great fun it would be if he had the power to turn all white men as black as crows, if only for a month, so that they could experience just for a little while what his people have had to experience over in the last couple of centuries. This African civilization movement had quite a few prominent members of the clergy from all over the Maritimes. And the big push for this group, and as I said, he began pushing this just before 1900, was an en masse immigration of all educated Canadian blacks back to Africa. Now, he was willing to take a few educated Americans and blacks from other countries with him as well, but he could not abide laziness in any form, and he would not take, he said flatly, he would not take any lazy Negroes with him. He would, however, be open to take any educated, sympathetic white folks with him. And the idea was to go to Africa, set up a British colony, British laws, British customs, get established, get self-governance from the mother country, and then gradually spread out and Christianize the entire continent. That's a pretty tall order. Initially, he claimed he could do it with 10,000 people as a seed or nucleus for this colony, but over time, that number grew a little bit. And so did his time frame. He thought he could, at first he said 10,000 people, and then within a year, he would reach out to everybody on the continent, but he later revised that quite a bit. Now he's campaigning full time. He's lecturing and traveling quite a bit. But in the days, of course, this is 1900, before mass media of any kind, he only has two options at his disposal: the written word and the spoken word. This movement to this idea of an en masse immigration to Africa was not the first time it was tried. Back in the 1870s, Reverend Henry McNeil Turner was a prominent man in the AME church down south took a group of 500 blacks to Liberia to set up a colony and establish new life for themselves over there. But they didn't stay long. And in very short order, they all came back. So, like I say, the only options Abraham had open to him to get the word out was the spoken word and the written word. And so in 1903, he becomes the first Black Canadian to become a magazine publisher with the emergence of Neath. And the first issue was in February 1903. Each issue was about 60 pages in length, and 50% of it was dedicated solely to race issues. And he made no apologies for this, because he said other Canadian publications don't address the issue of race at all, and American publications act like Canada doesn't exist. So he made absolutely no apologies for using his magazine to advance his race agenda. But he also had quite a few very notable contributors, members of the clergy, local clergy. Attorney General was one. The Reverend W.O. Raymond, a noted historian and minister at St. Mary's Church in St. John, was another. Another contributor was his son George. Now, George was the only one of the 5 children that would survive beyond the age of 22. And George was a very highly educated man too. In his life, he spoke 7 languages fluently. And there he is there at his church in Shelburne. He had a parish in Nova Scotia where he had a church in Shelburne and another one in Yarmouth. He later moved to the United States. Abraham used Neath. Unfortunately, he only got 5 issues over the course of the next 12 months before the magazine went out of business because of lack of readership. And then he went full-time lecturing and traveling, and he didn't rest. He was, they say a rolling stone gathers no moss, and I'm sure there was absolutely no moss on Abraham Walker. So I've found newspaper articles where he's addressed this subject in Nanaimo, in Montreal, in Toronto, Saskatoon. He's been in Europe, all through the Maritimes. He made some journeys down into the US as well. There's a couple of newspaper ads, one from 1901, the other from 1905, one of them where he was in Halifax, and His Royal Highness the Duke of Cornwall in York was actually in the audience listening. The one on the left says he's in Toronto, but he's just recently returned from the UK. And it was on one of these speaking tours in Ontario where he took quite sick and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He lingered on, in an unwell condition for a few months, but the last few days were quite bad. And on April 21st, 1909, he passed away and was buried in an unmarked grave in the St. John Cemetery. And simultaneously, his legacy swept under the rug of history. Well, that is until 2019, when he was awarded posthumously the Order of New Brunswick. Now, I thought it was the crowning glory of my research, if you will, for me to be able to accept this order on his behalf from the Lieutenant Governor, but I was wrong. The icing on the cake was being able to turn right around and present it to his great-granddaughter, Debbie Little, and her son, David, who came up from Michigan for the ceremony. Throughout my research, this may sound crazy, but there were times when I felt his presence. And there was, when I was stuck for a way to word something or where to look, all of a sudden I'd get a nudge and it'd be off in another direction. And it took me, I searched for 2 years for his descendants, but kept running into roadblocks and dead ends. And finally I gave up. 6 weeks before the ONB ceremony, Abraham Walker, I believe, intervened, and they called me. one Saturday morning, just out of the blue. Phone rang and it was Debbie. And you could have knocked me off the chair with a feather when she told me she was Abraham Walker's great granddaughter. Melinda and Charles, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. I will leave you with just one last thing, a quote from the great man himself. A man should not be measured by his race or his color or his creed, but by the size of his soul or his heart or his mind. These words, I think, should be painted at the front of every classroom in every school in the country. Thank you for allowing me this time, and I'll turn it over to you, Melinda.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was absolutely fascinating. I had no idea of all the details of his amazing life story. Just goes to show. And I do agree with you. Sometimes fate, he probably was in the background pointing you in the right direction. Isn't that wonderful? What a great story and an inspiration. And you know, you had a you have much credit to you for bringing his story to life, because it probably would not have been without that research. And I see that Dr. McCarthy is showing his wonderful book. It's called Abraham Beverly Walker. This wonderful book is well described and it is for sale. So now I also like to thank Dr. McCarthy for her great introduction. So let's get the questions in the chat out of the way, and then we can move on to people who would like to ask a question over the mic. So the first question is from Richard Yeomans, also known as Murray. Did Abraham Beverly Walker ever express his thoughts on Black thinkers in the United States, either while he was in Canada, or in Atlanta, excuse me, or back in NB? I'm thinking of specific individuals here, such as Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, perhaps even W.E.B. Du Bois, since Walker died the same year the NAACP was founded.
He did. He had high praise for the likes of Frederick Douglass and Daniel Payne and Henry McNeill Turner and others. But he was really quite scathing of a lot of American literature and the arts at the time. You have to remember that this minstrel music was very popular, and he couldn't stand it. He was loath to even listen to it. He said of the American writer that there are a few good ones, but for the most part, literature is dead in the U.S. or the novel is dead.
Okay, I'm going to now. Kathleen Curry has a question. Did Walker ever comment on the treatment and rights of other groups of people who face discrimination, like Indigenous, Asian, Eastern Europeans, or Irish Canadians?
Not that I could find. There's a great much, most of his writings don't survive. When he traveled around giving lectures, he sold copies of them at the door afterwards. And there's only about a half a dozen of these that survive. And for a guy that was on the talk show circuit, so to speak, for 20 years, that's not very many. He did mention at one time that he had authored a book, some 800 pages in length, and it was at a New York publishing house. But that was the last. I couldn't find out anything more about it. Obviously, it never got published. But, that was very close to the end of his life.
Okay, Brenda Orr has the following question. Do we know what the Black population of New Brunswick was at that time?
The black population of New Brunswick, I don't know the exact number, but for all time from the 1780s onward, it hovered between 1.5% and 2.5% of the total population. Not very big, not very large.
Karen Taylor says, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and a hello to Dr. McCarthy from Woodstock. And thank you for a great introduction. Now, another question from Charles Ferris. Great talk, Peter. Can you tell us about Mrs. Walker?
A little bit, yes. She was she was from Lawrencetown, Nova Scotia. She there's not a whole lot that I know about her. She had a business of her own. She made paper flowers and that kind of thing for decorations. She had a shop on Main Street in the city's north end. Uh, it appears for a while, like around 1905, 1906, that they were actually living apart because they appear she's living on Main Street and he's living on Dorchester Street. But the next year they appear to have reconciled and are back together. You know, he had a very busy schedule. I can see where it would, you know, she'd get a little annoyed from him being away a lot. And but she didn't live long after he did. Almost 2 years to the day after Abraham died, she was laid to rest too.
Another question from Joan Headley. Can you tell us more about his family? Anything will be welcome.
Okay, he had 5 children. Abraham Jr. and daughter Bessie both died at the age of 13 in St. John. They weren't twins, but they were they died a couple of years apart, but they're almost the identical age to the day. Had a son, Jack, who died when he was 22. He was a musician. His daughter, Sarah, married a chap from Digby, and within a year, she had contracted tuberculosis and she died. And so that left George. George had 4 or 5 children. I can't remember. But he, when he left the South Shore of Nova Scotia, he moved to the States and had several positions down there in various churches. And I can't remember where George died. The family that came up for the award ceremony there, they live in Michigan. George has one granddaughter who's still alive, living in California. She was 96 years old in 2019. And Debbie sent her the Order of New Brunswick medal. And she sent me back a picture of her aunt with holding the award. So, and the other thing about the family, Abraham pounded away at education. Education was the key to everything. That message sunk in with George. Like I said, George was very highly educated. All of his descendants have post-secondary education. The idea of advancement through education is a family trait. And his mother, apparently, his mother was a brilliant woman. And when she died in the 1880s, her obituary makes a statement about her level of intelligence as well.
Mary Louise asked, I think maybe he's touched on a few of those in his just previous answer, Mary Louise, but perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more. Peters, Mary Louise says, I can't imagine the loss of 4 children. Can you talk about the current family that you met in 2019? So that would be the great-great-granddaughter. Where do they live? And I mean, what are they? You said they were educated as well, the whole family?
Yes, the ones I spoke to have all been to university. I think Debbie was a nurse. David, I think, is an IT guy. I know one of his daughters was in university at the time. The family was planning to be here in the summer of 2020, but of course, this little thing called COVID stepped in. After the award ceremony in Fredericton, they came down. They were only here for one more day, so it was a really quick visit. I took them over to Kingston, took them to the cemetery, took them over to lunch, took them around a bit, and up to Ralph Thomas took them up to the library to show them the copies of Neath that the library has on file. So, but they were planning to come back, and still are. I'm still in touch with her. So it's hopefully this pandemic is behind us and they can come.
Another question from Brent Wilson. Did Abraham Beverly Walker encounter public opposition to his ideas? And if so, what form did it take?
I'm sure he did. The newspapers around St. John were probably the worst newspapers on the planet when it came to reporting news. I get more details from his talks, his lectures, from the paper in Nanaimo than I did from the ones in St. John. I would say he encountered all kinds of opposition simply because nothing ever happened. If his ideas had been met with some degree of acceptance, things would have changed a little bit at least. As far as his career goes as a lawyer, there was one instance in 1885, the St. John Law Society was celebrating its centennial. And it wasn't arranged by the Law Society itself. It was a private function, but held by another lawyer or by a lawyer. He invited every barrister in the county, those working and those still retired, and those retired, except for Abraham Walker. And the only thing I could find, the only mention of it, was all hell broke loose in the Law Society. Abraham did have his supporters. George Gilbert was one, Judge Palmer was another, and there was a couple others, but he encountered a lot of resistance.
Another question from Joan again, and I actually was wondering too, has his grave been located? And I'll just add to that question of Joan's has there been a marker put up?
Well, the only marker put up was that stick with the red paint on the top that I put in. Years ago, a man named Lennox Bagnall sought to document all the burials in that graveyard. The cemetery is the old Church of England cemetery on Thorne Avenue in St. John. And when I was a kid, there was about 20,000 tombstones in there, and most of them were falling over. And it was all grown up in weeds. And it took an accident where a bunch of kids were playing, and the tombstone fell on the guy and paralyzed him before the city decided to fix it up. And they threw all the stones away. But Mr. Bagnall's book has the plot plan of the graveyard, and although it's far from complete, Abraham Walker's grave is mentioned, and so and the plot plan is drawn to scale. So I must have looked like a vampire hunter out there with wooden stakes and a hammer and a tape measure, trying to triangulate from tombstones that still exist, and that spot is pretty much where he is. Now, the family had talked about putting up a memorial, but I haven't asked them about it since.
Well, I'd say the final chapter in Abraham Beverly Walker's life has yet to be written. And I think that let's see what happens there. I think that it would be most appropriate for a grave marker to be put there. And I see Joan has said she would donate money for a gravestone. So I think that is a fantastic idea. And I think we should do something about that. Yeah, I think we should do something about that. Now, I am at the end of the questions in the chat. So if anyone would like to ask a question through the, someone else is asking, Mary Louise, is the city going to do a memorial street or park or something?
Yes, I got asked the city to do something. I met with a representative from the city and told him basically I didn't want a park bench. At first I had suggested to rename King Street East. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's a wide boulevard, and it would be ideal to change the name of it to Abraham Walker Boulevard. But there'd be 300 and some odd people would have to change their addresses. And then I thought something more apt would would be to change the name of the area where the new law courts are. Peel Plaza, it used to be called Peel Street, but there's no houses on it anymore. And the only building that would have to change its address is Vito's Restaurant. So either that or there's going to be a new K-8 school built in the city south end next year. Now the city has no authority to name it, but I've been pounding away at the school board for the last year or so to promote Abraham Walker's name for the school, because education was, it was the big driver. So it would be very appropriate if a school was named after him. But the city is going to do something. They're going to form a little working group to sit and yak about it, and asked me to sit on that.
I have one more question. Oh, geez, there are two more questions. Okay. Karen McGill. Can you elaborate more on why you think the lost building should be named after him? You mentioned it briefly. And Joan has a question. Do you think the Law Society will ever apologize for snubbing ABW? And perhaps also have a bust of him made?
I think the law building should be named after him because he was the first Canadian-born Black attorney in the country, and he was the first student of any color to enroll in what became the UNB Faculty of Law. Now, at the time, it wasn't. It was associated with King's College, but nevertheless, for those two reasons, plus to get rid of a slave owner's name. Well, I guess the name's already gone. The doctor, he has a Doctor of Civil Law. I don't know what university. He didn't mention it in his CV. He applied in 1885 when he was having difficulty making a living as a lawyer for official court stenographer. Now, this is a position that he lobbied the government to create, saying that trials are taking altogether too long because the scribes are writing everything down longhand. And he said they should make a position of an official court stenographer, do it in shorthand, and it would shorten all the trials by 50%. And he applied, and he mentions in there that he has a Doctor of Civil Law, but doesn't say where he got it from. As it turned out, he didn't get that position. And 2 years later, I found a mention in the newspaper where the Attorney General said that since they instituted the position of chief court stenographer, trials time has been cut in half. So he was right. What was the other question?
The other question was, do you think the Law Society will ever apologize for snubbing ABW? And perhaps get a bust of him made, because I understand they have busts of people.
Yeah, I think they will. I don't want to speak out of turn, get anybody in trouble here. Before I embarked on applying for the order in New Brunswick, I thought where he's been snubbed twice, well, not snubbed, but he was told twice that he was going to get the Queen's Counsel and King's Counsel designation, and then had his name ripped off the list. I'm going to ask to see if he can get one of those posthumously. So I wrote to Mark Richard, who's the chief judge here in New Brunswick, and I didn't figure I'd ever hear from him, but after about a month, he wrote back, and well, he didn't write back, he called me, and he said there's no provision in the law to award a posthumous QC, but he said you should think about the order in New Brunswick. So he sent me down that road, and Mark and I have become friends since, and he mentioned that the Law Society may do something along the lines of a bursary or a scholarship, but I don't think they've done anything yet.
I'm going to just open the floor. I'll give, if anybody would like to ask a question verbally, they need to unmute their mic.
Yeah, did he have any liaison with the Black community at Willow Grove?
Not that he ever mentioned. like during the time, his early days in the as a lawyer, and during the time he was studying was about the time that Edmund Hilliard Duvall was building the black schoolhouse in Willow Grove. But I've never heard any mention that or seen anything that Walker said about the settlement out there.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. That's great. We've had an excellent back and forth here tonight, amazing conversation and a great subject. And thank you so much, Peter, for making the 5th presentation in the York Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series, virtual speaker series, mind you, this being 2021. And I want to remind everybody that next Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m., Caitlin Steva will be speaking live via Zoom on Fredericton's Black Soldiers during the First World War. Another fascinating subject to help us mark Black History Month. So I hope to see you again next week. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum. Email frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com. By telephone at 506-455-6041. You can check out our Facebook page, Fredericton Region Museum. So we hope to see you again next week, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much for having a great presentation tonight. And thank you, Peter.